Good morning, everybody. Anthony, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And how amazing was it to start off the morning with a little bit of music? That was so great. So who here loves their community? Let's hear it. Who here loves their community? My name's Art Reyes. I'm from Flint, Michigan, and I love my community. Despite the challenges that we've faced over the past 30 or so years. And before I dig into some of the nitty-gritty of some of the key questions in organizing that I'd like to talk to some of you about today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I organize. So I remember when I was in about second or third grade, I'd call up my friends, and when their parents would answer the phone, I'd ask, "Hey, is Dan there?" And then I'd count how long it took them to get to the phone from where their parents had called them. 13, 14, 15. And then after I got done talking on the phone, I'd run to my mom and be like, "Mom, it took Dan 25 seconds to get to the phone. They must have a really nice house." See, we lived in a trailer park, and I wanted so badly just to live in a house, like all of my other friends from school. And my mom would look at me with her strong eyes and say, "We'll get there someday." This idea that we'll get there someday has been pervasive throughout my family history. My great-grandparents were migrant farm workers, who ended up settling in Flint because the auto factories were hiring. It was their shot at a better life. My great-grandmother, a woman who helped to raise me, grew up in a small town in Texas where there was a lot of segregation, where there were signs on restaurants that said, "No Mexicans and no dogs." And she would tell me as I was growing up, "Mijito, you're an American first," because to her, this country, our community, Flint, symbolized the possibility of opportunity, the idea that we can get there someday. And so growing up, I also learned that you had to fight for it. So I come from a long line of auto workers, and I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my dad. My little brother is about 2 years old at the time. I'm 10 years older than him. He was sitting on my lap. My sisters were at the side, and my dad was across from us. And my dad leaning in and telling us, "Hey, kids, we're not going to be able to go school shopping this year because they were on strike." And I remember him telling us, tears kind of welling in his eyes, breaking the news to his kids that, "Hey, I got $100 a week from the strike fund, but there are some things that are worth fighting for, and this is one of them." And so I remember going out every day to the picket lines that summer with my dad because I wanted to be there for that fight. And I also really wanted to go school shopping, so I needed some new shoes. So, some of these things that kind of shaped who I am in so many ways are rooted from my community, rooted from Flint, rooted from this idea that was pervasive throughout my family history, that we will get there someday. And so for me, it was really important after I was able to go to school, got a scholarship, was able to go away to school, to do a really interesting and prestigious fellowship and got some job offers that would have paid pretty well. But for me, we'll get there someday did not mean just me. It meant, for me, it was my community. It was the idea of my community and being a bridge back to that. And so, right now, I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School where I've had a chance to meet Ed and get to know Ed a bit and just really feel all of that passion. And so when Ed asked me to come and address you all here today, to be honest, I was a little nervous. I went through and I looked at the website and saw people with these fancy little mics and all the lights and all of these things going on. And then I got here last night and I just started to get a vibe for it. Francis picked me up from the airport and was telling me about, Roanoke and all the interesting things that were going on. And then I got there to the Kirk Street Fair and was able to interact with some really, really great people and hear the love and the passion and the commitment that they had to their communities. And I started to settle in. I started to feel at home. I started to feel like, okay, these are my people. These are folks who are also really committed to their communities, to making change, to doing good in the world. And so, what I'd like to do today, just kind of briefly, just giving you a taste of, through my lens, how I see making change and doing good in the world. I think there's many, many different approaches to doing social good and creating social change. And I just want to give you a little taste of what organizing and my experience doing that has really meant to me and shown me. So for me, it's essentially really about democracy, right? So this is just the kind of etymology of the word, Greek root from demos, the people, and kratia, the power or rule. And I think it's really easy for us to often forget this power piece, particularly in a lot of our communities that have been struggling, or communities that have maybe been left behind, communities like my own in Flint or in Detroit, where I did a lot of work. And I have a deep belief that democracy functions best when all voices are heard. But this power piece, I think, is a really critical element to that. And so, as I was figuring out how I wanted to best help my community, how I best wanted to start building power in my community, one of the ways for me was through elections and voting. And so I worked as an organizer with an organization called Michigan Voice, which is a coalition of advocacy and organizing groups across the state of Michigan. And one of the things that for me that I kind of saw in my head, when I was developing the strategy, when I saw strategy not as I do now as a verb, but rather as something that I did alone on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, kind of coming up with the great idea. And for me, after reflecting on it, it started to look kind of transactional. In 2009, we were preparing for the census across the country, but in Michigan, a lot of our municipalities and states were lacking the funding to really support a lot of the efforts. And I saw it as a window of opportunity to start building inroads into some of the communities that I really cared about. Communities like Flint and Detroit, neighborhoods that were economically and politically marginalized, and said, here's a window of opportunity that I can start building some capacity in these neighborhoods, and I can really get folks focused on the census and then work toward continuing to work with these people on the election. And so I started doing these trainings across the state in a lot of these neighborhoods where it was a lot of me talking, a lot of me, kind of delivering verbal mail, telling people the things that we needed to do to turn our community around, and using a lot of rhetoric and passion to really get people bought in we need our voices heard. We need to build power in our communities. And I'll never forget at one of these meetings, it was in Detroit, this old woman, after, I was feeling pretty good, felt like I had just delivered a pretty good training and everything, and we're kind of going through the end debriefing. This old woman stands up, and she tells me, look, I've participated in every census that I can remember. I vote in every election since I've been old enough. I've lived in the same house for 40 years, and I've watched my community get nothing but worse. I've seen more issues with drugs and crime. I've seen more vacancies on my street. I've seen less resources from the community. So how can you stand there and tell me that if I vote, if I participate, if I do these things, that things are going to get better? And I stood there and I couldn't. I couldn't tell this woman who just told me her experience what that looked like. And for me, it was a transformative piece that I needed to stop going around bestowing wisdom upon others and developing the strategies in my head that then I delivered to others. But I needed to start listening, and I needed to start actually really engaging the communities in a meaningful way. And so I started, kind of reformatting these trainings into community meetings across the state again, and went back to the same, really devastated communities and started talking to folks. And the theme that kept coming up that people were saying is, look, the way that we're engaged on elections is not in a meaningful way. If you look at the way that folks, if we're talking about power here, if we're looking at the ways that elected officials or organizations that kind of sweep in, interact with us around elections, a politician might come into our community 2-3 weeks before an election. Maybe they'll go to our church and talk at our church and make a bunch of lofty promises and get some people really fired up. Or maybe during a big election, a big organization that's funded from DC will parachute in and we'll have a ton of people kind of leafleting and knocking on doors and things, and then they're gone until the next important election. So if we're looking at this from that viewpoint, what is the incentive? What's the incentive to participate in the system that has failed so many people so many times? That their faith in democracy and the belief that this is a system that will work is eroded. And so for me, it was really a point at where I looked, how can I start working with people to develop strategies? And so for me, we started working with organizations that already had established trust, existing relationships, and a constant presence in their communities that were there all the time, that weren't sweeping in and sweeping out, and saying, even if they didn't do organizing or voting or any of those things before, how do we work with them to learn what they really care about and how we build the additional capacity to start doing some outward change-making work? How do we get the organizing capacity, not just in an election that I might care about, where it's a transactional relationship, where I say, my organization really cares about this election, you should engage, even though you've had these terrible experiences before. But how do we work together to say, how do we start to build power together over time? And it was really important for me to realize there were no silver bullets. There were no kind of one great idea that I came up with, this strategy that suddenly kind of changed the way things happened, but rather this was a slow churn over time that required a lot of people taking responsibility and a lot of people engaging. And maybe, and for me, a principle that we held true that for us was really important was to be voracious truth tellers, is what we would say. Because if we did the same things that politicians or that the electioneering organizations were doing, we were just contributing to further eroding that trust in democracy. And so for us, it was about meeting people where they were and being honest. So one is this, who are my people? Right? And a lot of times this is a step that we jump over. Right? But before you can really understand who are your people, I think it requires us really taking an inward look at, who are we? What are our values? What are the things that we care about that allow us to connect with others? You don't have to, in my opinion, as an organizer, you don't have to be a member of a particular community that you're working in and be, I've grown up in this neighborhood the entire time to actually affect change, but you do have to have aligned values. And you have to be able to express those values to others, and you have to have that point of shared values in order to really understand who are my people. And the next is, what is their problem? A lot of times that I've found in organizing and social change work and and being around a lot of people who are so passionate and committed and talented, is that a lot of times this is a step that we skip. Instead of what's the problem, here we jump to the solution. We jump to a really great idea that we've thought up without really starting to understand what's the problem that we're actually really trying to affect. And this is kind of a really critical one. It's one of the things that Marshall kind of frames as like, this is kind of one of the core questions of organizing, is how do we turn the resources we have into the power we need to create the change that we want? Right? I'm going to say it one more time. How do we turn the resources we have into the power we need to create the change that we want? And so, for me, it takes a real relationship building and keen understanding of the resources that a community has to dig in and to really answer this question. And so I just wanted to use an example that I think is a really potent one. So for me as a student, I'm kind of a student of social movements and really dig in and try and learn as much as I can about things like the labor movement and the farm workers movement and the civil rights movement. And one of the ones for me that I think hits these questions is the Montgomery bus boycott. And so, if we're looking at this through the analysis of these questions, of what it looked like, this question of who are my people, at the time in Montgomery, where people were being denied dignity, where people, where African Americans in the community were asked to give up their seat if a white person kind of came on and didn't have a place to sit within the kind of bounds, the sections of the white and black sections of the bus. And so the people there, as we kind of digest this, the kind of example of it within the organizing framework, were very specifically the African American bus riders. But I think it's really important to be really specific. Though the impact and a lot of the broader piece of who it touched was much broader, the constituency of who was generating that power, because the power needs to be generated from the constituency, was African American bus riders. And what was their problem? Well, their problem was they were being denied dignity, denied human dignity And so the system of segregation on the buses was a really critical problem, right? And so I wanna narrow in on this idea that it was segregation on the buses as the very specific problem, because a lot of times in folks who are passionate about creating change, we think so big. We wanna end poverty, or we wanna end racism, or we wanna end global warming, right? But getting your bearings around what that actually means and how you can actually do it is near impossible. And so unless we can have something concrete and specific to work from, then it's really easy for us to just spin our wheels. And I think the Montgomery bus boycott was a great piece of this. So, the outer circle, ultimately, one of the big picture problems, right, was the institutional racism that existed and exists in this country. Segregation as an institution as a whole across the South was a broad problem, but the specific problem for this particular constituency was segregated buses. And because of this, because the specific piece was around segregated buses, that the strategy as it unfolded after Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st in 1955, and the Montgomery bus boycott started the next day thanks to leadership of folks like Edie Nixon and Joanne Robinson and the very young Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. This piece right here, this segregated buses, was how they were using the resources that the community had to build the power that they needed to create the change that they wanted. And so the resources that they had were their feet. The resources they had were the ability to opt out of a particular economic mechanism that was creating injustice for their community, right? So they had the ability to say, we are boycotting the buses, and we're going to use our feet, and we're going to walk. And then tapping into the resources of other folks who were either allies to the community, or in large part the black middle class, that were using their resources as cars to create the shuttles that were getting people to work. And so for 381 days, the Montgomery bus boycott prevailed and eventually succeeded. But the piece here, these concentric circles for me, is that it's about the building of capacity for a community to see the specific problems that they're interacting with, and how to attack those problems that can build their capacity outward to start impacting these other larger circles. Because if it started with, here in Montgomery, we are going to end institutional racism, wrapping your head around what that means and what that looks like is near impossible. But because it was specific and concrete and the constituency was clear, it allowed the capacity to be built that was able to then broaden after that victory. And this is what stemmed the civil rights movement, right? This is where a lot of this was really born. And so, this is, and I feel like I'm not really, don't have the time to really do the case justice, but I think that it's just an important example that I wanted to bring up, because often we're taking really big approaches without actually asking, who specifically are my people? What specifically is the problem that we can do? And how do we start to use the resources we have to attack that allows people to build to build their capacity to mobilize their resources? And so, a big piece of that is really around leadership, right? So just a quick kind of diagram that I'll tie back here in a second. But, the first kind of a leadership poor organization or movement or entity, right, often exists where there is kind of one person that functions as this central dot, right? That like this, and a lot, I've been there, I'm sure many of you have been there, right? Where you are so passionate about the work that you're doing and you're taking on, and you are the one man or one woman show, right? And you're doing everything, and you're coordinating everything, and you're figuring out everything in your head and how everything is done. But ultimately, the onus is all on you, right? And so there's a lot of different ways and reasons that this kind of comes about. But ultimately, a leadership-rich movement or entity or organization is one that does, where everything, the weight is not all on that central dot, but is rather built out, right? This is what what Marshall's teaching team that we call kind of snowflake leadership, right? It's about building the capacity of others to start to lead, to take on responsibility, to have this sense of shared responsibility for accomplishing the things that we need to accomplish to address the problem. And this is really critical, because I think as an organizer, there's no way you can do the things that you're tasked to do if it's all you. It doesn't happen. It's not realistic. It's not a way to function. And so if we're going back, and for me, an organizer, as when my younger brother, like I said, he's 10 years younger, I remember him asking me, like, what does that even mean? What's an organizer? And for me, the easiest way to explain to him, I mean, we're from Flint, so big kind of car town, is like, it's basically a mechanic for democracy, right? We're trying to make sure that some of these areas that aren't given attention, or some of that we're able to grease the wheels, to lubricate the engine, and to make sure that this thing functions. And so just going back, to kind of wrap it back to democracy. Oh, that's a little blurry. So it says the people within the red circle. Sorry if you can't see it. And power are two of the really critical questions. And for me, after doing the work that I've done, and really interacting with the community, and working to build power with people, it's such a privilege to be able to share just a taste of what it's looked like through my purview to start to create change in my community. And I'm so excited for the rest of this weekend to hear about the change that you all are working toward creating in your communities, and getting new ideas and those and things there. And for me, I love my community and my state of Michigan and my country too much not to hold ourselves accountable for the promises that we make as a society. And so through my lens, as an organizer, I just want to wrap up with putting democracy back front and center, because unless we are really engaging and having all voices heard in our community, or in our society, then there are voices that get left out, and voices that get marginalized. And it's critical for us to really ask ourselves the hard questions of, are we working with people to create social change? Or are we working on behalf of them, or for them, or on them? And that's a real question when we're asking ourselves, when we're reflecting back on what democracy is and means, because we can't forget about the power piece. So thank you so much for entertaining the idea of listening to me for a few minutes, just sharing a little bit of my experience and where I'm coming from. Grateful very much for the opportunity, and humbled to be in front of such a talented and interesting crowd, and I can't wait for the rest of this weekend.